Buonasera. Nei giorni scorsi Stefan Lofven, il primo ministro socialdemocratico della Svezia, che era in carica dal 2014, ha avuto dei problemi politici molto seri. Come sapete, sono arrivati persino a noi in Italia, è arrivata la notizia, anche se diciamo la verità, non siamo sempre attentissimi a quanto avviene in altri stati europei, perché la politica italiana, perlomeno prima di questa fase inaugurata dal governo Draghi, ci dava, come dire, abbastanza a cui pensare da solo. In Italia alcuni commentatori hanno messo in correlazione il voto di sfiducia subito dal primo ministro con il cosiddetto modello svedese nella gestione della pandemia, cioè col fatto che la Svezia ha chiuso di meno e ha cercato di tutelare le attività economiche un po' di più di quanto abbiano fatto altri paesi da che è con noi il Covid-19. Le cose non stanno in realtà proprio così, come è emerso anche rapidamente, anche sui media italiani, e in realtà i problemi politici di Lofven vengono da altre questioni. Ne parliamo oggi con un amico, con Nils Carlson, che è economista, scienziato politico, autore di un libro molto interessante che si intitola Statecraft and Liberal Reform in Advanced Democracies, che è uscito qualche anno fa da Palgrave e che mi permetto di consigliare. Nils è stato il fondatore ed è presidente di Ratio, che è un importante centro studi indipendente che ha sede a Stoccolma e che conduce ricerche interessanti da un punto di vista, credo di poterlo dire senza offenderlo, liberale. Quindi questa sera avremo l'opportunità di imparare qualcosa sulla politica svedese da Nils Carlson, che ringrazio molto. Nils, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, it's a pleasure.
Well,
Glad to be here.
Well, in the last few days, we had news of some turmoil in Swedish politics, and the problem of the prime minister have been put into a context and were seen by some as basically an output of the strategy, an outcome of the strategy the Swedish government has followed when it comes to the pandemic. So I'd like to ask you to what extent that is true. I suppose it's not really like that. But also, more broadly, I'd be grateful if you could explain us how the Swedish political system works, and what do you expect to happen now? Because, of course, all sort of scenario can come after, a prime minister loses a confidence vote.
Well, in fact, he was reinstated as prime minister a couple of hours ago here in Sweden. So we have a system here where the prime minister only needs to be tolerated in the parliament. So he cannot have a majority against him, So there was a vote here at around 3 o'clock this afternoon, and a majority did not vote against him. So the parliament has 349 seats, and only 373 people there in parliament, members, voted against him. And they would have needed 175 members of parliament to vote against him. So he's back in business, and he will continue his government together with the Green Party, but he will have a very unstable, a very weak position here in the coming year. Sweden has an election in September next year, in 2022, and he will have a hard time get his budget through parliament in December this year, because in order to get the budget accepted by the parliament, you need a majority. So it's quite possible that not social democratic, not green parties, liberal conservative, if you want, right-wing parties will have a majority for their own budget. And Lofven, if he's going to stay in power, he may have to go into an election year without his own budget. So this is a situation we haven't seen in Sweden for I would say 2-3 decades. It's a very unstable situation. It's an extremely weak government. And it's going to frame the way and shape the way Sweden will look in the future, I think. So it's very interesting.
Why do you say so? I mean, why is it so important what is happening now in order to shape the way in which Sweden will look in the future?
Well, let me put it this way. I mean, the Swedish Social Democrats, in contrast to the socialists in France, the Social Democrats in Germany, the Social Democrats in the Netherlands, for example, is still a major, and in fact, the major party. So they have around in the polls and also in the last election, somewhere around 27% of the votes. And that's high by European standards. And as you know, the Swedish welfare state, all these universal welfare systems and so on, were more or less built from a social democratic ideology, even though we've had non-social democratic governments for some periods. But I think this may be the end of this, actually. So they had a minority government together with the Greens here since 2018. And that government then was voted out of power a couple of days ago or a couple of weeks ago, but now they're back. But they're in a very weak position. So Sweden is becoming normalized in a sense. We're not anymore, I think, dominated by the Social Democratic Party. And I think in the coming years, we will see a movement further into a more, I would say, conservative, liberal kind of political situation in Sweden, which I think will be good for Sweden, actually.
In a sense, that happened before, right? I mean, basically in the 90s, Sweden went through an important fiscal crisis and the welfare model has been updated substantially. So if I understand it right, part of the Swedish model now is economic openness. Sweden scores very high in indexes of economic freedom, for example, because it's a very open, a small open economy. And when it comes to the provision of welfare services, you do have some areas like elementary education, for example, where you do have a certain degree of competition between, government provision of these services and private provision of those services as well. So to what extent there is a consensus in Sweden now that you need to balance economic openness with some sort of welfare provision? And to what extent that consensus is rooted in a profoundly social democratic culture all across the political spectrum?
No, I think you're correct in saying that there is a consensus about the welfare state, about having these kinds of open, universal, general kinds of systems supporting public schools, healthcare, and so on. But there has been a shift, as you say, since the 1990s. And I've written about this, how this change occurred. And Sweden liberalized in many ways. Choice was introduced within the systems. Taxes were cut down in many areas. We deregulated many markets, a lot more than continental Europe in general, I would say, even more than the US in some areas, for example. And Sweden, Sweden has done extremely well, I would say. Also in this pandemic, I mean, the Swedish recovery is extremely strong and it's due to these reforms. But what has happened is that Swedish society has become more pluralistic. We've taken in a lot of immigrants to Sweden. So more than 20% of the people living in Sweden are born in another country. That's a higher percentage than the US, for example. I think they have 13% or something. So it's close to countries like Canada, Australia. And these immigrants, some of them are doing well, some are having severe problems entering into labor markets because of strict labor market regulations, because of very high minimum wages, for example. Regulations on housing markets that we still have. So there are areas where I think the majority of the population in Sweden don't think that general welfare is a good thing anymore. So in fact, we have started to cut down in different welfare systems, social benefits, and so on. I think we will see changes on the regulations on labor markets. That's actually coming up already through the present government, because they were depending on a center party, which is a kind of liberal party, farmers' party by origin, but they have strong ideas about deregulations, lowering taxes, deregulating labor markets, and so on. So I think Sweden, there's a good chance that Sweden will take further steps in a liberal direction. The fear is, of course, that this huge influx of immigrants also have created a demand for a more populist right-wing party in Sweden, the Swedish Democrats. And they are the third largest party in Sweden now. So after the Social Democrats, the moderate party, we have the Swedish Democrats. And they are pro-welfare state, anti-immigration, anti-liberalism, I would say, in general. And that's a problem. So it's going to be very interesting years, I think, in Sweden in the coming years to see whether we will go in a direction of the Swedish Democrats, preserving the welfare state through becoming more protectionist, by closing borders, by being less open in many ways, or, as I believe, and I think there's a good chance for Sweden to move in a more classical liberal direction, if you want. But that's open, still open. You know.
Well, this is tremendously interesting. I mean, on the one end, many scholars, just some works by Alberto Lesina, for example, come to mind, have pointed in the past towards the fact that people are happy to redistribute in as much as a society is relatively cohesive and homogeneous. So in the past, clearly one of the driving force of the Swedish welfare state, of the Nordic welfare state, generally speaking, was that these were small states, relatively homogeneous, relatively I won't say close-knit communities, but places that could understand itself as a community of similar persons. So the idea is, if I look to somebody else and he's in trouble, she's in trouble, and she looks like me, it's typically, it's easier for me to accept a higher degree of redistribution. But of course, what happens when you add immigrants, to this picture, typically is, alas, the fact that you do see movements that basically say, well, we want more welfare, we want to keep this, and therefore we need to be more homogeneous as a community. In a sense, I think it's a rather interesting thing that happened also within the boundaries of the left. I mean, the left is perhaps less cosmopolitic and less universalistic now than it ever was since the French Revolution. They understand that they need the nation state because it's the only institution they can use to do what they really care for, which is redistributing money. So I'm glad you're optimistic. And I would like to ask you why you're optimistic. I mean, is perhaps the public debate in Sweden saner than in other countries, more rational, more
I would say so, yeah.
Cooler in a sense?
No, I think you're correct. I mean, if you compare to Italy, for example, if you compare to the US, if you compare to France, even the UK, I would say that political culture is quite civilized in Sweden. We all still have a good public discussion. There's a lot of people complaining about, of course, the media being leftist and so on, and that may be the case, but I think it's, and this is something we have to preserve, of course, in this new situation, which is more diverse, more pluralistic, if you want. And let me add, it's not only immigration, it's also increasing economic inequalities, I would say. I mean, Sweden has today a very compressed wage structure, for example. But when it comes to private ownership of houses or private wealth, capital, and so on, the divisions have increased, of course. And the left tried to profit by this. We still have a former communist party in parliament that don't call them communists anymore. And also the social democrats constantly talk about this, the increase in inequalities from a very equal start, of course, But people don't seem to care, to be honest. I find this extremely interesting. So I did a book actually last year, it's in Swedish, unfortunately, but it's called Fair Inequalities. So this annoyed a lot of people. They became extremely upset that I said that certain inequalities are fair, and for numerous reasons. And then there are strong philosophical, empirical arguments behind this, of course. And I think we can win this fight now. 5-10 years ago, it wasn't possible, but now I think we can win it. But that's my optimistic side. The more pessimistic side would say that, no, we have all these divisions, this
Yes, we do have a problem.
discussions.
Can you kindly repeat what you just said? Because we had a problem with the connection.
I had a lag here or something. Yeah. No, but I'm saying it may go the other way, The optimistic side is that we will handle this, and I think we should be optimistic. But there is a risk, of course, that this increasing divisions in culture, in religions, in backgrounds, but also in economic possibilities and so on, in wealth, will cause conflicts of different kinds. But I haven't seen this yet, I think it's going to take 5 or 10 years for this to happen, but I think we have a good chance to restart this liberalization that I myself was very much part of in the 1990s, actually.
So if you think about the priorities in terms of reforms, I suppose labor market reform would be very high, which is something that actually, people that tend to be in favor of immigration do not realize. I mean, how important, if you have to be, welcoming to immigrants, is to have a labor market that allows them to find a job. And then what? Some more means testing when it comes to welfare provision?
I think that's already happening, I think in practice we have not indexed our welfare system for many years, so the levels are falling. So it's not anymore. It used to be a system where a certain percentage of your income was, in a sense, secured by the state, by the government. That's not the case. So the welfare systems more provide a basic security nowadays, which I think is fine, maybe it should be even lower, but it's coming to levels that are decent, from a liberal perspective. The housing market is still very regulated, so that has to be fixed. And of course, the taxes, especially the taxes on incomes, on personal incomes, are extremely high in Sweden. I mean, we still have marginal tax rates in practice, if you take direct and indirect taxes, of 60-65%. It's absurd, So it's actually, it's not the rich who pays for the welfare state, it's ordinary working people who pays for the welfare state. And that situation is not sustainable, I think, in the long run, actually.
Well, you mentioned, you mentioned housing and rent control. There was something also related with the confidence vote against the prime minister, right?
That's what triggered this thing, actually. So the left party, the former communist party, said that they would not support this minority government, which the left party they have always supported social democratic governments, whatever. But there was a minor thing that the government had promised the Center Party and the Liberal Party in Sweden, apart from these labor market reforms that are going on, and even lowering marginal taxes have happened, you know. So the support of the Center Party, the Liberal Party, was depending on a very small piece of deregulation when it comes to newly built rental apartments. So only for new apartments
Well, the gods of Zoom.
Party said,
well, the gods of Zoom are against us. Let me ask you again. So you were saying, because we got another glitch, only for the newly built apartment. Let me try to deactivate my video.
A very marginal reform, yes.
Okay.
I lost you completely, Alberto.
Well, no, I just switched my camera off, hoping that this way. Well, you know, it's. I have to say, I'm still tremendously illiterate with these things, in spite of having used them for 1 hour, for 1 year, because of course of the pandemic. Let's move for a second to the pandemic management. So, to what extent was the government responsible for that? To what extent were independent bodies responsible for the way in which Sweden has decided to face the COVID-19 threat? And, you know, how do you see things went? My impression is actually that Sweden was, let's put it this way, less open than other Europeans thought. That actually you got lots of social distancing at various levels. But I'd like to hear your view before getting into you know, this hopefully post-pandemic recovery you were talking about.
To put it simply, it's two things that is important to understand about Sweden. We did not have a clause in our constitution that allowed the government to have these kind of severe restrictions that you had in Italy, France, and so on. So we couldn't have a state of emergency except in a situation of war, actually, you know. So they couldn't make those decisions that were made in other countries. Secondly, we have a tradition, at least since the 17th century, that the bureaucracy in Sweden, the governmental agencies, are independent from government in a sense. So the parliament and the government, they decide about laws and how laws should be implemented. But the agencies and the bureaucrats. So that meant that it was quite natural for Sweden to have the Swedish Health Agency to handle this kind of situation. This does not mean that the government did not have a role or could not have a role. Some people criticize them, of course, for having had a too limited role. I was quite happy with how it developed, and I think this is one of the reasons that Sweden has done extremely well, I think, during this pandemic. Sure, the death rates are quite high, but we have preferred economic, social liberties, civil liberties of various kinds. There have been basically very few laws restricting how people could act and so on. It has been recommendations about social distancing, recommendations to wear masks and so on and so forth. But just, you know, in the last few months, we had some more severe restrictions. But apart from that, Sweden has been quite comparatively open compared to many other societies. And that's, of course, also the reason why the recovery is so strong. You're still there, Alberto?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
When you say the recovery is so strong, what's the scenario? What are you looking for?
If you take me, we are back to pre-pandemic economic levels in GDP already in the first quarter this year. So we had a drop in 2021 by 20 of course, by 2.8%. But we're already back to a level higher than that. And that's quite amazing, and some of the other Nordic countries, Denmark and Finland, has done very well also with lesser death, but I think we made some mistakes, of course, in the early phases, but in general, I think we've done well to keep society open, to keep the economy open. And it's not only government policies in this, pandemic sense, it's also because we have a very high level of internet access, broadband access all over Sweden. I do think that these welfare systems we have, where people didn't really become unemployed in the way that we didn't have to expand the state budget much. I mean, we don't have a big deficit. We don't have these problems that you have in Southern Europe or the US or the UK have actually. The public budget is extremely strong. We're making.
We lost you again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, so of course, it was a bit strange because you were praising Swedish broadband, and then we got this problem.
I don't have broadband here. I'm in a summer house in southern Sweden.
Well, I see that, and I'm glad you can rest a bit. How generous was the Swedish state with business this year? Have private business been generally subsidized in the pandemic? What sort of measures have been taken?
Basically, the most important support was not really support for business, but for the employees in companies. So we introduced, just before the pandemic, actually, a system that was used immediately, similar to what Arbeit in Germany. So when the pandemic hit, the government took over some of the costs for the employees in companies, meaning that people could work part-time, but still having 20% of their income intact, So when the, especially I would say in April, May, June last year, there was a sharp decline in Sweden also, all over in all sectors. But then, especially the export industries recovered very, very quickly. And already in the fall last year, there was a strong recovery, I would say, in manufacturing sectors. While, of course, sectors like hotel, restaurants, transports, and so on, still have problems, even though they're recovering at the moment at an extremely high pace, actually. So it's
once again,
it didn't cost much in practice. Are you there?
So yes, now I can hear you. So you said support to business didn't cost much to government budget, right?
In the end, it cost a lot less than we expected it to cost, actually, because the recovery came early. Yeah.
Okay. And when it comes to vaccines, what was the policy?
The vaccine, we were part, just as Italy, I guess, with this European system, which was a bit late, complicated, bureaucratic, but since we have this culture in Sweden, that is, we tend to trust even the government in this country, That's a high level of vaccination. So I think over the age of 70, way over 90% are vaccinated. I think of the adult population, over 65% have taken one vaccine at least, and something like over 40% have two shots of vaccine. So given that, let's say 20% have had the infection or something, have had the virus, we must be approaching some kind of herd immunity zone.
Well, it's very interesting what you said, that, you know, the public trust of the Swedish population basically makes the Novaks a very small group.
Yeah, it is a very small group, and it's actually people come from Ethiopia. Did you hear me?
Well, no, we missed you. So you were saying that Novaks are basically immigrants.
Some immigrants,
Okay,
not all immigrants, especially immigrants from Ethiopia and Syria. Yeah.
So they're basically skeptical of vaccination for cultural
because
reasons.
And they don't trust the government and so on.
Well, you know, this has been a very interesting conversation, Niels. And, you know, can you just summarize for us what are the next steps, so to say, in Swedish politics? So when are election going to be? You told us that you see the government having troubles in having its budget approved. So, you know, if we need to keep our eyes open on Sweden, what shall we be looking for?
Well, I don't think much will happen until after September next year, when we have a general election in Sweden. Maybe this government will not have its budgets accepted in December this year, because it's a very weak budget. But I think that Prime Minister Lofven will stay in power until September next year. It's going to be a very important year. And in fact, these labor market reforms that I mentioned will still be implemented. So it's a major reform, kind of reform that you would need in Italy and Spain would need as well. So it's a combination of deregulation, but also investments in lifelong learning, competence development, and so on. Very interesting reform, actually. So that's what will happen in the next year. Not much will happen, I can tell. It's kind of a stalemate at the moment here, well, which is fine in a sense.
Well, absolutely. A last question for you. So, how is Swedish public opinion doing these days when it comes to the European Union? Is there a strong support for the EU? And what do people and political parties make of next generation EU in particular?
I think the Swedish population, according to current polls, are very positive to the European Union. I think everyone I know, excluding myself, who are interested and really follow what goes on in the European Union, are becoming increasingly skeptical and critical. I've done quite a bit.
We've missed you again. You've done quite a bit. Mi scuso molto per questi problemi, ma la qualità della connessione, evidentemente la broadband svedese che Nils non ha, perché ci ha detto che nella sua casa di vacanza non aiuta. Ok, siamo riusciti a ricollegarci. So, Nils, you were saying that you're growing more critical towards the European Union.
And I think this is true not only for me, and I think for most people who are well informed about what's happening in Brussels and the development, I think, especially when it concerns the social pillar, when it comes to European minimum wages, transparency directives, posting directives, so on and so forth. I think both Parliament in Sweden, social partners in Sweden, experts who follow the EU are becoming increasingly critical. And to add to this, I think this new industrial policies where you want to pick winners, and now the Commission wants to use all this recovery money to subsidize certain industries and certain technologies and so on, is extremely problematic. So it's also, I think this recovery funds, funded by borrowed money is problematic, without really having the support in the basic agreements, the basic foundations of the EU, the constitution, if you want, to the EU. So we really have to follow what goes on the European level. I have a book coming out, hopefully, on this with a law professor I've been working on for some time. Yeah.
Well, then we look forward to that. And it's interesting what you said. So you got, the common people, so to say, the layperson, who is still very strongly pro-European in its orientation, but you got growing concern among politically informed.
Let me put it this way. I mean, we're in the process of creating a welfare state on the European level. And since we in Sweden have a long experience of how welfare states can run amok and get into serious troubles, as we had in the 70s and 80s, I find it very problematic, actually, the current developments in the EU.
Well, also given the size and the fact that basically this will end up with some sort of permanent flows of money going from some part of the EU to some other part of the EU, and
transfer union, for sure.
Yeah. So I fully understand, even though, of course, I mean, we in the South want to be the main beneficiaries of such a transfer union. I do understand why other states do not want to be those who subsidize the rest of us. So it's going to be a political fight, clearly.
It's going to be a fight.
In next few years. And it's interesting because the European Union typically tends to go on by kicking the can and finding a consensus, taking, always very careful and middle of the roadish position. It will be interesting to see if this can happen this time or not, or if it's one way or another, sort of.
I think it's going to be extremely hard. It's going to be extremely hard to stop this process. I think it's the momentum is so strong now that it's going to be hard.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We're very grateful to Nils Carlson for this lecture on Swedish politics. So thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Take care and good luck.
Bye.